On May 2, 1889, in the Ethiopian camp at Wuchale, two men placed their seals on a promise of peace. Menelik, King of Kings of Ethiopia, believed he was opening a door to trade, weapons, and diplomatic cooperation. Across the table, Count Pietro Antonelli signed for King Umberto I of Italy. The treaty spoke of friendship. Nothing on its surface sounded like surrender. Yet the document existed in two languages, Amharic and Italian, and those versions did not lead to the same future. One preserved Ethiopia's freedom to speak for itself. The other would soon be used to claim that Ethiopia had handed its foreign affairs to Rome. Stranger still, the treaty declared both texts equally official and perfectly aligned. So what had Menelik signed? An alliance between sovereign states or the beginning of a protectorate? The answer was buried in one article, and before long, ink would become blood. To understand why Wuchale mattered, look beyond the table and across Africa. European powers were dividing the continent through treaties, occupations, and wars, often drawing borders before the people inside them had any voice. Italy had unified only decades earlier and wanted the colonies and prestige enjoyed by older empires. Its foothold on the Red Sea coast gave it a base from which to look inland. But Ethiopia was not an unclaimed space on a European map. It was an old, complex empire with rulers, armies, churches, trade networks, and diplomatic traditions. In 1889, however, it was passing through a transition. Emperor Johannes IV had died in battle, and Menelik was moving to secure recognition as the new ruler of a realm containing powerful regional leaders and competing interests. That made Italy appear useful. Friendship with Rome could provide weapons, access to coastal trade, and recognition, while Menelik strengthened his position. For Italy, the same relationship offered influence, territory, and perhaps something greater, a path toward controlling one of Africa's strongest independent states. Both sides therefore approached Wuchale with ambition. The difference was that Menelik sought an advantage inside an alliance. Italy saw the alliance as a ladder into empire. Menelik did not open Ethiopia's door because he failed to recognize European ambition. He opened it because power in 1889 required bargains. His authority was expanding, but it was not effortless. Regional rulers had their own armies and interests. Rival claims could reopen conflicts. Beyond Ethiopia's borders, hostile forces and colonial powers were testing any weakness they could find. Italy offered tools Menelik could use. The treaty regulated trade and movement between the two states. It addressed customs through Massawa, the Red Sea port controlled by Italy, and permitted arms and ammunition to pass through that route for the Ethiopian ruler. Rifles were not decorative prizes. They could strengthen Menelik against domestic challenges, defend frontiers, and help transform a political order into a more centralized empire. There was also recognition. By negotiating with Menelik as King of Kings, Italy appeared to acknowledge his status months before his formal coronation as emperor. From Menelik's perspective, cooperation could buy time, equipment, and room to consolidate power at home without accepting foreign command. That is what made the treaty so effective as bait. It did not arrive as a demand for submission. It arrived wrapped in promises. Peace, commerce, weapons, diplomatic access, and mutual protection. Italy could present itself as a partner while positioning itself as something more. Both governments were calculating, but their calculations were not equal. Menelik believed he was using friendship to strengthen Ethiopian independence. Italian leaders believed friendship might become the instrument through which that independence was taken away. The most dangerous weapon in the Treaty of Wuchale was not a rifle, a cannon, or an army waiting beyond the hills. It was a single sentence, Article 17. In the Amharic text, Menelik could use the Italian government as an intermediary when dealing with foreign powers. The choice remained his. Ethiopia could ask for diplomatic assistance, or it could speak to other nations in its own voice. But the Italian version carried a far more threatening meaning. Its wording was interpreted to mean that Menelik consented to conduct his foreign affairs through Italy. That tiny shift from may use to an apparent obligation changed everything. One version described cooperation between sovereign states. The other gave Rome the basis to present Ethiopia as a protectorate, a nation whose voice abroad now belonged to someone else. A diplomatic channel had been transformed into a chain, and a friendly service into political control itself. And then came the treaty's bitterest irony. Article 19 declared that the Amharic and Italian texts agreed perfectly, that both were official, and that both possessed equal authority. Yet precisely where sovereignty was at stake, they did not agree. The document claimed harmony while concealing a contradiction powerful enough to destroy the friendship it promised. Historians have debated whether this was a calculated deception, a reckless mistranslation, or the result of an Italian draft left unchanged after Menelik rejected compulsory wording. But intent does not erase consequence. Italy possessed a sentence it could exploit. Ethiopia possessed a text it had actually accepted. Between them stood the difference between assistance and obedience, partnership and submission. On paper, it looked like grammar. In reality, it was a knife pressed against the throat of Ethiopian independence. And Rome was preparing to tell Europe that the blade had already done its work.
Italy did not wait for Ethiopia to accept its interpretation. Rome moved as though Article 17 had settled the matter. In October 1889, the Italian government notified the European powers that Ethiopia stood under Italian protection. With a diplomatic announcement, an alliance was recast as a relationship between a colonial power and its dependent. Menelik discovered the claim when he attempted to communicate with foreign monarchs, including Queen Victoria and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Their replies pointed him back toward Italy. The message was unmistakable. Europe had been told that Ethiopia could no longer speak for itself. This was more than an argument over translation. Italy was using the treaty to build an international reality around Ethiopia without Ethiopian consent. If other governments accepted the protectorate, every embassy, negotiation, and foreign agreement could reinforce Rome's version of events. A claim repeated often enough might begin to resemble a fact. For Menelik, the betrayal was profound. He had agreed to friendship, not guardianship, cooperation, not silence. Italy possessed no Ethiopian administration, commanded no Ethiopian army, and had received no obedience from the Ethiopian people. Yet abroad, it was presenting itself as the voice of an empire it did not rule. The knife hidden in Article 17 was now in the open. Menelik answered the foreign powers directly, rejecting the protectorate and defending Ethiopia's right to conduct its own diplomacy. But Rome would not surrender its claim. The dispute had escaped the treaty table, and the path toward confrontation was narrowing.
Tetu understood that the dispute was larger than one mistranslated clause. It concerned the right of Ethiopia to exist as a sovereign power. She was deeply involved in court politics, advised Menelik on major decisions, and viewed Italy's protectorate claim not as a misunderstanding to be politely managed, but as a threat that had to be resisted. Her position was uncompromising. Friendship could not require Ethiopia to surrender its voice. A country that needed another government's permission to speak abroad was no longer fully independent. Taytu's anger gave emotional force to the argument, but it also reflected clear political judgment. Accepting Italy's interpretation, even temporarily, could allow the fiction of a protectorate to harden into international fact. Menelik initially tried diplomacy. He challenged the Italian reading of Article 17 and sought to preserve relations without accepting submission. But Rome refused to abandon the version that gave it authority over Ethiopian foreign affairs. The disagreement became impossible to contain. In 1893, Menelik formally denounced the Treaty of Wuchale, declaring that Ethiopia would not recognize the protectorate Italy had announced in its name. That decision did not instantly create war, but it removed the mask of friendship. Italy continued expanding its influence from Eritrea and prepared to enforce by pressure what it could not secure by consent. Ethiopia, meanwhile, began acting as the sovereign state it had always claimed to be, communicating directly, gathering support, and preparing for the possibility that diplomacy would fail. Taytu's refusal mattered because it gave the crisis a simple moral center. This was not merely a quarrel between translators, it was a choice between speaking freely and being spoken for. The treaty had promised peace, but neither Taytu nor Menelik would purchase peace with silence. Soon, the argument over words would be decided by armies. Italy now tried to enforce with soldiers what it had failed to secure through consent. From its colony in Eritrea, the Italian army pushed deeper into Ethiopian territory, expecting superior organization and modern weapons to break resistance. Menelik answered with a nationwide call to arms. Regional rulers who had once competed for influence brought their forces together beneath a common cause: the defense of Ethiopian independence. Empress Taytu marched with the campaign, commanding her own followers and helping sustain the army gathered in the north. This was not a desperate crowd armed only with spears. Ethiopian troops carried large numbers of modern rifles, fielded artillery, understood the terrain, and were led by experienced commanders. Their greatest strength, however, was political. Italy expected division. The invasion produced unity. Near Adwa, Italian commanders faced shortages, uncertain maps, and pressure from Rome to attack. During the night of February 29, 1896, their columns advanced separately through broken mountain country. Units lost contact. Distances were misjudged. By dawn, the army intended to strike as one force had become dangerously scattered. The Ethiopians seized the moment. On March 1st, Menelik's commanders overwhelmed the isolated Italian brigades, one after another. Taytu's forces joined the struggle, while fighters from across the empire closed around the invaders. The battle was brutal, but its outcome became unmistakable. The colonial army was shattered. Thousands were killed or captured, and the survivors retreated toward Eritrea. Adwa was not a miracle, and it was not an accident. It was the result of diplomacy, preparation, weapons, leadership, terrain, Italian miscalculation, and a society mobilized against foreign rule. The treaty that had attempted to silence Ethiopia had instead helped awaken a national resistance. Italy had carried its interpretation onto the battlefield, and Ethiopia answered in the one language Rome could no longer distort: defeat. The story returns to the table at Wuchale, where friendship had been written in two languages and understood in two different ways. Italy believed Article 17 could turn a diplomatic privilege into imperial authority. Ethiopia proved that no sentence, however interpreted, could erase the consent of a sovereign nation. After Adwa, the balance of power was reversed. Italy could no longer demand that Ethiopia live beneath a protectorate it had never accepted. In October 1896, the Treaty of Addis Ababa ended the war, annulled Wuchale, and recognized Ethiopia's independence. The claim created by disputed words had been destroyed by Ethiopian resistance.
But Adwa's meaning reached far beyond one battlefield. At a time when European empires were carving up Africa, Ethiopia demonstrated that conquest was not inevitable. Its victory became a source of pride for Africans and people of African descent worldwide. It showed that unity, preparation, leadership, and the refusal to accept another nation's definition of freedom could alter history. The sharpest weapon brought to Wuchale had not been hanging from a soldier's belt. It had been hidden inside a sentence, wrapped in the language of friendship. Yet a treaty can create obligations only when its meaning is honestly shared. Italy tried to speak for Ethiopia, but Menelik, Tetu, and the people who gathered at Adwa answered for themselves. The friends had arrived carrying knives. Ethiopia saw the blade, refused to kneel, and survived. Subscribe to the channel and like this video for more stories of history's forgotten turning points.